Hello, I'm Corey Heaton, the Extension Wildlife Specialist with Clemson Cooperative Extension Service. And I'm going to give you a little talk today on solar pollinator habitat, how we establish it and maintain it over time. And hopefully this will complement the presentations you've heard from Ben and TJ earlier in this session. A successful solar farm is not an accident. We really need to start thinking about what we're going to do with regards to installing habitat or pollinator habitat within these installations long before we start laying out the installations themselves. It doesn't need to be an afterthought. This needs to be thought well out in advance of putting the solar systems in place. Pollinator habitat can be established in those existing solar installations that are out there, but there's going to be a whole lot of hurdles that we got to get by to make that happen. So ideally, we want to start planning for this months or years prior to actually implementing solar habitat. There's some key components that'll help us to be more successful when it comes to establishing this habitat. Timing is crucial. We'll talk about that more. Site preparation is probably the most important component of all of it. Seed and plant selection. You've already heard a lot about that in the previous talk. Planting methods. There's a lot of room for error when it comes to planting these things, so making sure you're doing it right is very important. And then competition management. Competition management is going to be a big component of whether or not you're successful. Planning is a really important part of site prep and successful plantings in general. In a good site prep plan, we're going to identify all the obstacles that we need to overcome in order to make this thing work. So some of the things that you might consider during this planning phase: what was the previous use of that site? Was it a forested site? Was it a traditional ag field? Was it in pasture? Whatever that previous use is really important, because it's going to determine a lot of things about how we move forward with preparing that site. One of the other things to consider, and this ties in a lot to what that previous usage was: what plant species are currently present? You'll hear us talk a lot about weeds and invasives and non-natives and all these other things, but a lot of the plant species that show up on these sites are valuable wildlife species that are not non-native, and they're not invasive species. So getting a good detailed list of what plants actually are on that site prior to setting this thing up is really important. Soil changes throughout the site is another big component. A lot of these installations are large, and in some of the counties and some portions of certain counties, we may change soil types 5 or 6 times moving across one solar installation. And that can have a big impact on which species we use, and that's a pretty important thing to consider. You could go to the Web Soil Survey and learn more about that specific site using GPS coordinates, but that would be a valuable tool for you to check out. Hydrology of the site is another big component that we often overlook. What happens to the water on that site when we get a rain event? That's really, really important when we're trying to establish these plants, because if we have too much slope in any given direction, we may wash all of that seed down to one spot. You may wind up with a really dense plant stand in that area with nothing uphill of it. So that hydrology of that site is really important. And then the timeline to get all these activities in place. If we don't do a plan, we're going to find ourselves lost at times in here trying to get caught up and get things done on time. So I would really, really support that you would go out and develop a good timeline for your practices during that planning process. Timing, again, planning for a pollinator habitat in these solar farms needs to start very early in the process. In fact, I would say before the design phase of the solar installation itself, we should already be thinking about this pollinator habitat. Herbicide applications to help clean up these weed populations, that is going to need to start at least a year before we start planting. Some of these species may require more than 1 year, especially some of our turf grasses like Bermuda or Bahia. We may need 2 years to get those under control before we plant. The last thing that you want to do on these sites, though, is disturb the soil any more than you have to. So our last soil disturbance should occur prior to the final herbicide application that is made before planting, or right before we put down coverings for solarization processes. And the reason behind that, if we come through there and we kill all the weeds that are present and we disturb that soil again, we're ultimately going to move more seed back up into that upper layer of soil and give it the opportunity to germinate. So once we've made our final herbicide application, we don't want to do anything else with disturbing that soil other than to plant. Pollinator plantings can take place throughout a good portion of the year, primarily in the fall or early spring. What you really want to take into consideration is you don't want to be planting late in the spring when we're going to approach dry weather and high temperatures. We would like to get those plants somewhat established before we hit those dry, warm months. In the fall, it's an opportunity to plant that is very similar to what you'd see in nature. A lot of these plants are dropping seed in the fall, and that seed's making its way into the soil at that point in time. So fall plantings very much mimic what we would see in the wild. And with some of these plantings, you might hear from time to time that we need to add a cover crop with it or a nurse crop to help get it established. And if in your situation that winds out to be the case, I would suggest working with your Clemson extension agents and using the Clemson recommended planting guides for those small grains that we'd be using as nurse crops. You know, and this is an example of a timeline for if we wanted to plant a solar site in 2022. We'd come back to August through October of 2020. We want to, at that point in time, be looking at that site, beginning our plan, and we need to identify the status of the vegetation that's already there. Are there species that are going to be problematic to control? Are there species that may be beneficial to the project? If so, you know, if you do have an abundance of beneficial species at that time, it might be a good opportunity for you to start collecting some seed or some live plants to save for use in the project. It's also really important early on. You know, at this point, we're 2 years away from planting. We really need to be doing a good job of removing all the woody debris from that site. And this woody debris, especially if we're on a forested site, can cause some huge problems with that solar operation down the road. And you'll also see that over time, more and more of this woody debris from forested sites will make its way up to the soil surface. So starting in advance gives us the opportunity to make sure we have all of that cleaned up before we go in and plant. All right, so that was in August through October of 2020. By January or February of 2021, we're reviewing the blueprints for that solar site and trying to determine the best layout for that planting project. All right. I would highly recommend during that time frame, not only do you review the blueprint, you actually go out and visit the site to confirm that that blueprint matches what you think. A lot of times we let our minds play trick on us, and orientation may be slightly different on paper than what it is in real life. So go check it out and make sure everything matches up. It's also, at this point in time, I would encourage you to start looking and discussing these plants and seeds and availability with the different providers that are out there. The last thing you want to do is wait till the last minute and try to obtain seed or live plants. So a year in advance, you really need to be trying to nail that down and confirm what species you're going to get, which species these folks think would be best for your site, and making sure that they're available. By the spring of 2021, we're going to probably start making our initial herbicide applications. So we're going to visit that site, determine what species of plants were there. We're going to select the right herbicide, and we're going to start using those treatments to control that unwanted vegetation. It would also be at that time, I would recommend that you make your first soil disturbance. So 10 to 15 days after you apply that herbicide, go ahead and disc that site really well. And what that's going to do is hopefully you've killed a lot of the plants with that herbicide application, and by disking the soil at that time, you're going to bring a lot of seed back to the surface. That gives you the opportunity for it to grow and for you to be able to put an herbicide on it later. So what we're trying to do is deplete that seed bank that's there. We want to provide the seed. We don't want what is provided for us. All right. So going past the spring into early summer in June, we're going to assess the vegetation response to those herbicide applications, assess the vegetation response to those disking activities. And if we have sufficient vegetation coming back, it may be a good enough time to make the second herbicide application. All right. I would encourage you to work with your Clemson extension agents to make that determination, or your consultant, whoever you're working with, but you may be warranted for a second application that soon. Moving forward later into summer, by August of 2021, we're going to once again assess that vegetation response, and most likely by August it will be warranted to make another herbicide application. And if we do make that herbicide application, we're going to wait 10 to 15 days and we're going to disc the soil again to do the same thing. We're just bringing that seed bank back up to the top, trying to deplete it over time. In the fall of 2021, in October, we're going to assess that vegetation one more time, and we're going to make another herbicide application if it's warranted. It may or may not be, but if it is, we're going to go ahead and hit it again. This is a very, very common pattern for what you would see in a situation where we were dealing with difficult species like Bermuda grass or Bahia grass. All right. So in February or March of 2022, this is the year we intended to plant, we're going to go ahead and prepare that seed bed for planting. And by preparing that seed bed for planting, I mean it is ready to go. We could plant tomorrow if we wanted to. But once we get that done, we're going to make another herbicide application, all right, to knock down any plants that came back. We're going to wait the appropriate period of time, and then we're going to jump in there and go ahead and plant what we intended to plant. All right. So as you can see, this is a fairly complicated process. There's not a single step that will get you to a successful weed control, clean, weed-free seed bed. All right. We're going through multiple steps, and a lot of these things we're doing multiple times, but it is critical that we do it this way. And site preparation, again, the importance of it cannot be overemphasized. You know, the success or failure of these solar plantings is heavily determined by how good of a job we did with site preparation. Providing a clean, weed-free, well-prepared seed bed is critical to establishing these plants. It's also critical to the safe operation of these solar farms, and this is particularly true on those sites that were forested prior to solar installations. We're going to have a lot of root matter and a lot of other woody debris that is continuously working its way to the soil surface. One of the things we're going to use to manage these places is mowing, and if we've got a lot of woody material on the ground, it doesn't take a whole lot of effort for that rotary mower that we're using to pick that woody debris up and sling it through these panels. So we can have some serious safety issues there. Again, a weed-free seed bed is critical to making this thing work. So preparing that site needs to start at least 1 year before we intend to plant. All right. Some of these undesirable species, like we mentioned, may take multiple years. That's especially true for our turf grasses and some of our more problematic agronomic plants, especially some of the annuals like our pigweeds. They can require several years to deplete that seed bed and get us to a point where we can go forward without having to deal with them. And there's basically two ways that we're able to manage these weed populations to give us this good, clean seed bed. Solarization, and we'll spend some time talking about that, and herbicide applications, and we'll spend a little bit of time going through that as well. But we basically have two avenues to control those weed populations. Solarization, for those who are looking to do things in more of a chemical-free manner, I would tell you it was a better manner, but I don't know that it's any better than using herbicides. But they do both work, so it is an option. But solarization utilizes plastic and sunlight to sterilize the soils. All right, basically what we're doing is using that heat to kill weed seeds and some of those seedlings. So solarization is a good option there. Solarization provides multiple modes of action, so we lose weed and weed seeds through exposures to lethal temperatures. You also will see some suicidal germination. So even though that plant shouldn't germinate, the high temperature of the soil under that covering mixed with high humidity forces these plants to go ahead and germinate even though they know they're going to die. All right, so we lose a lot of the seed that way. And then the final way that we really lose a lot of this seed is through biological activities in the soil. The bacteria present in that soil really amp up when that soil warms up and we have good moisture content, which is exactly what we're doing in a solarization process. So by increasing that soil temperature and providing adequate moisture, the bacteria themselves actually degrade the seed bank and help us out and keep us weed free. So some researchers up in Maine did a project to look at soil temperatures as they relate to different methods of solarizing. So solarization typically is thought of as using clear plastic, and then tarping is another form of solarization where we would use black plastic or a colored plastic. And then they also looked at control in this study, which was just bare soil that they didn't do anything with. And basically what this figure is showing you is that through the use of solarization, we can raise those soil temperatures 30, 40, 50 degrees higher than what the sun was doing in the absence of that plastic material. All right. There's been some research done, and some of these more problematic species are more difficult to kill with solarization, and you may have to get soil temperatures up to around 140 degrees Fahrenheit for a couple hours to actually sterilize those seeds and those plants. Luckily for us, this graph was from Maine. In South Carolina, I don't think we're going to have a whole lot of trouble making it to 140 degree soil temperature in solarization, at least for a couple hours. And the other thing, this is a solar site, so it's positioned to maximize sun exposure, which is going to help us out a lot. There are some situations where solarization is probably not the best idea. Some species are really problematic for this. Yellow and purple nutsedge are probably the two most problematic. Just their growth form and the very stiff sharpness of that leaf is able to penetrate through a lot of these plastic materials. And when that happens and you have enough of them through the material, well, one, you're perpetuating a weed that we don't want in the site, but two, you're allowing heat and moisture to escape through the holes they create, so you may not have as an effective kill if those species are present. If they're there, that's good. We've identified that in our planting stages, correct? So we're not having to worry about it at this point. So just real quick, step by step, what we do with solarization. And if you look at this picture, this is an example of tarping, which is a type of solarization, but we're using a dark plastic. And this is in an organic farm we have in Columbia at one of our research facilities. But to go step by step through this and explain to you what we're doing. So initially what we want to do is thoroughly prepare that seed bed for planting. You know, when that plastic comes off, we shouldn't have to do anything else other than put the seed in the ground. So we're going to disc the soil. Depending on where we're at, we may have to till the soil and we may have to level the soil. All right. In some locations, especially where we have a little bit of clay content, we might have to do some subsoiling to break that hard pan to give these plants a chance. All of that should happen prior to us covering that place with plastic. Right. The next thing we're going to do is water that soil thoroughly. You know, once we have it leveled out and well prepared for planting, we want to water it. And then after you've watered the site, we can cover it with plastic. Once you get the plastic down over the site, it's really important that you bury all those edges. You know, throw some dirt over those edges so we can trap that heat in there. All right. Ideally, we want to leave that plastic in place for 4 to 6 weeks to let it do its job. Typically, that's going to happen during the hottest parts of the summer. So for us, July through August is preferred. There's no reason that you have to take that plastic up until you're ready to plant. So just because you're putting it down for July through August doesn't mean at the end of August take it up. I would encourage you to leave it in place until you're ready to plant. Not only does it stop the seed that is there that hasn't been killed yet from germinating, but you'll also find that it's going to collect a lot of seed as well, and you're able to get that off the site instead of allowing it to go into the soil. And then the next step is to remove the plastic and plant the seed. Easy enough, right? All right, so let's do the same thing using an herbicide. So we can use these herbicides to basically sterilize that site of the existing vegetation. We're going to use pre-plant applications to basically burn down all the plant species present. And then again, perennial species like some of those turf grasses may require multiple applications within the year prior to planting. Some of them may require 2 years of applications. All right. Depending on what species of plants are present, we may use a broad spectrum herbicide. We may use a selective herbicide, maybe one that targets specifically grasses, or a combination of chemistries. We may have both broad spectrum and selective products that are used. Those planning to use herbicides to help clean these sites up before planting, I would highly encourage you to work with your Clemson Extension agents for technical assistance. When we are using pesticides, we are under the guidelines of federal law, and I would make very sure that I'm using the right products in the right place at the right time. Well, what does that mean? All of these products have a label that has been approved by EPA, and it tells you what species of plants you can actually use the product for, and also what areas you can use the product for. Since this is a solar installation, we're going to need to use products that are labeled for either utility right-of-ways, for fallow field areas, or those that have a wildlife designated label. You know, any of those three topics will cover you for the work you're doing in a solar farm. But you need to make sure about that and double check the products to make sure it is labeled for the site you're going to use it and the species of plants you're trying to control. So a quick herbicide plan, just an example. If we had a site that the dominant vegetation was Bermuda or Bahia grass, what one might look at doing the year prior to a planting, maybe come in April and apply an imazapyr herbicide. I won't get into specific names, but I will give you the basic chemistries. There's lots and lots of products available, and I don't think we could get through all that in a day's time. So I'm just going to give you the main chemistry that we're using. So in April, we're going to apply an imazapyr herbicide. Coming back in May, we're going to reevaluate the situation and see what we have. All right, there's going to be some Bermuda or some Bahia that escapes that initial application. And in that situation, what I would do is come back in with a broad spectrum product like glyphosate, and I might add a graminicide or a grass herbicide, clethodim, sethoxydim, fluazafop. Any of those products would work well, and combining the two together is going to give you a pretty good result. Then I'm going to come back to this site sometime between June through August, and if warranted, I might make another glyphosate and graminicide application. Again, moving forward, September, November, I'm going to use the remaining amount of my labeled allowance for imazapyr. And this is a pretty stringent herbicide program, but it's necessary when you're dealing with plants like Bermuda grass and Bahia grass. They are really difficult to eradicate from a location. And then after I've made that application, hopefully I have everything under control and I'm going to be good to go in the following spring when we wanted to plant. But before I plant, I would encourage you to make sure that we don't have a weed issue that spring, and if you need to, make another application before you plant. And again, I can't emphasize this enough, work with your local Clemson Extension agents to make this plan site specific for you. There's a lot of different chemistries that we can use to help control this vegetation. Some of the most common ones that we're seeing utilized on these solar sites are imazapyr, imazapic, glyphosate, 2,4-D, triclopyr. There's some mixes of triclopyr plus 2,4-D, clethodim, and sethoxydim. Those are going to be the primary chemistries that we're dealing with. All right, switching gears. The soil preparation component. This, again, is critical. Soil prep is a big part too. It's very important that we're clean and weed-free, but it's also important that we have a nice, good media to put these seeds into. All right, so you need to disc those soils heavily to 4 or 6 inches of depth. And disc soil is not always ideal for planting. On some sites it may level itself out fine and be okay, on others it's not. So in many situations we need to come back in and till those soils to further reduce the soil structure, help break everything up, and to help us smooth that soil out. All right. To smooth that soil out, Cultipacking may be necessary. It'll do a good job of leveling those seed beds and firming them up and getting them ready to plant. So our planting rates. There's lots and lots of different options here. TJ went through a whole list of plants with you. We have plants in the technical guides, and you have opportunities to discuss this with the seedling suppliers and seed suppliers. Get a blend that works well for you, but you know, in looking at this across the board, native warm season grasses are a fairly important component for these. They provide a pretty good refuge for not only birds, but also some of our pollinators. I would encourage you to, I think the minimum you can have in this program is 5% of the total mix in warm season grasses. I think you could take that anywhere in that range from 5 to 30% and still provide exceptional habitat for grassland birds, early successional birds, as well as our pollinator species. So a 5 to 30% mix, what does that actually translate to? Depending on what species of warm season grasses you're using, that's going to be somewhere between 1/2 and 3 pounds of pure live seed per acre. And then our native wildflowers, again, these are going to be planted in a mixed, most likely. We're going to be somewhere in that neighborhood of 8 to 15 pounds of pure live seed per acre. I think 10 pounds is a pretty common number that I see folks going with. And then native plugs. A lot of folks are going to have areas where they plant live plants. So they're grown in containers and they call them plugs because you pull them out and they look like a plug when they come out of that planting media. All right, if we're planting plugs, we're looking at 1 per square foot. It's a lot more expensive to plant plugs, but I'd say your success rate and overall survivability probably goes up dramatically. But one thing, if you had portions of a project that were going to be more difficult to establish, those would be ideal locations for you to come in with native plugs. And it'll fill in a little faster. You'll have more of those survive. Also, native woody species. There are portions of these solar installations that we can get away with putting woody cover in, and I highly encourage that addition where we have the opportunity to, especially in some of those buffer zones and where we're not going to be shading those panels in any way. But I'd like to see those on a 20 to 50 foot spacing, linear spacing. And then I'd like to see the addition of clusters of these woody species. So every 4 to 6 foot plant spacing. So you get tight little clusters of these woody stems coming up. And putting those clusters every 100 to 300 foot as we move across that buffer zone that we're allowed to plant woody stems is going to provide a lot of habitat for multiple species. We were talking about pure live seed in the previous slide. So what is pure live seed? I know this confuses some folks, but pure live seed is the percentage of that seed bag. When you purchase that seed and it comes in a bag, it's got a label with it and it tells you what's in there. And one of the things you're going to see on there is the percent pure seed. And that's pretty important. We need that to figure out the amount of pure live seed. But pure live seed is the percentage of pure seed times the total viability. All right, and then you divide all that by 100. So I have an example in here for you to look at. The seed label reads that it has 93.8% pure seed, if you're looking right in here. All right, and then we want to look at germination. Germination is a big part of live seed. So if we come on down, we can see that germination is 32%. Hard seed's also another component. In this situation, we have 0%, and then dormant seed, 61%. All right. So in order to figure out pure live seed, we're going to take this 93.8% and we're going to multiply it by 93%. 93% was obtained by adding these 3 numbers together: our germination, our hard seed, and our dormant seed. And that gives us our total viability. So in this example, we had 93.8% pure seed. We had 93% total viability. We multiply those together and then divide by 100. That gives us 87.23% pure live seed. So if we wanted to plant 12 pounds of pure live seed, then we're going to have to actually plant 13.76 pounds of seed. All right. Now, how are we going to plant this seed? There's a lot of different options for planting this seed. And from my experience so far, I think a lot of us have different methods that we prefer. But I think we all agree that a clean level seed bed is very, very important to making this overall thing work. So we're not going to do any soil disturbances, disking, tilling, or any of that after our final herbicide application is made or after we remove the plastic from our solarization. After we've done that, seeds can be drilled using a conventional or no-till grain drill. They can be planted with a cultipacker planter. They can be planted with wind spreaders. We'll look at some other things on this, some whirlybird type planters. And then again, we have some folks who are going to be using plugs or live plants. We can plant those by hand or mechanical transplanters. The biggest issue with all of these systems is making sure that you don't plant too deep. It is very, very important. These are supposed to be very shallow plantings, an 1/8 inch to a 1/4 inch maximum. If we start going more than a 1/4 inch deep on planting some of these seeds, you're not going to get them to germinate. And if we're planting plugs, I have seen issues where people were putting plugs way too deep in the ground. Just as a safety measure, I tell folks not to plant below the potting media. So don't go any deeper than that potting media already is. Hand spreading, hand spreading is advantageous because we can use seed that we've collected ourselves relatively easy. It can be cleaned or it can still be on the stems. Mixed or single species, it really doesn't matter. It's just spreading everything out. It works really well for small areas. I wouldn't want to have to plant a 1,000-acre solar farm with a hand spreader. But if I had bare spots that I needed to replant, it's a good option for that. Machine planting, you know, you can plant these with single species or mixed species, cleaned or not, doesn't really make a difference. You can use the hay blowers, the seed drills, or the rotary and drop spreaders. So you got a lot of options for machine planting. Fluffy seed of some of these grass species can be very problematic for planters. It doesn't like to move through that planter. The fluffiness just collects together, and you'll often see the agitators just spin it around and it doesn't seem to move. So when we're doing that, we may need to add a carrier to that product to help it move the seed through there. Some people use cracked corn. Pelletized lime's always been my go-to. Ground kitty litter works very well. What I would encourage you to stay away from, I've seen this a few times, don't use fertilizer. You know, we can really damage that seed if we have too high of a nitrogen content in there and basically render it sterile. So don't use fertilizer as a carrier, but you do have many other options. And with the no-till drills, we got to have a specialized seed box if you're going to use these no-till drills. We need agitators, we need a larger tube. A lot of these picker fingers, you know, are on the wheels. We need those to be able to grab that seed and move it through. And even in those situations with some of these wildflower mixes and warm season grasses, we may still have to add some type of carrier there to get that plant seed to move. So here's an example of how I do it. I take the seed that we're going to utilize and pelletize lime, and I use it at a 50-50 rate. Not based on weight, but on the volume of a bucket that it fills up. So I'll fill the bucket halfway with pelletized lime and halfway with the seed that I'm going to plant. I then mix it by hand in the bucket. Once you've got it mixed up well, then you can pour it into your planter like you see on the far right. And it works really well. You know, I think there's different sizes in both the pelletized lime and also in the kitty litter. And there's different size seeds in there. But by having different size seeds and different size carrier, the auger seems to do a pretty good job of mixing those up and making them get through that planter. And it evens out the way that it plants instead of dropping it all in one spot. No-till drills, there's several of these on the market that are designed for planting these wildflower mixes and warm season grass mixes. They're a very good, accurate, precise method of doing this, but you have to have the specialized seed boxes and you need to have bigger tubes feeding that thing. So there's only a couple models specifically designed for this. John Deere has one out. I think most folks are familiar with the Great Plains box. A lot of this acreage has been done with a Great Plains machine, but there are several options out there. The biggest benefit of drilling these things with a no-till, minimizing soil disturbance, so you're not encouraging a lot more weeds to come in, all right? But you can control the depth very well with this machine. If you have a good level seed bed and you set this thing right, if everything's in good working order, you should be able to maintain the depth of planting across that site. That's very important. Not only that, you can evenly space those seeds so they have a fair chance and they're not getting out-competed because a whole lot of seed was put in one area versus another. It's evenly distributed across the whole site. We can still plant conventionally, like we discussed earlier. You could broadcast these things with a whirlybird over exposed soil. A lot of folks already have these cyclone spreaders or whirlybird spreaders. They're pretty inexpensive. I'm not a big fan of planting large areas of these seeds with these methods. In my experience, you wind up having more seed in some locations versus other locations. It seems like every time you hit a little bump, more seed flies out there than it does at a normal speed moving forward. But it is a viable option. You can do it this way. You could also use a drop spreader like you see in that bottom picture. But again, you run the risk of getting those things a little bit too clumpy, where you're putting out more seed in one area. It's not evenly distributed across the site. Both of these methods do work, but I don't think you're done when you use either one of these two methods. I think you still need to come back in and pack that seed one time to ensure that you're getting good seed-soil contact. If not, if you do this and following it, you get a heavy rain event, you may have all your seed washed down to lower topographies. And we have seen that on solar installations in South Carolina already. So this is a good method, but make sure you get that seed a good firm seed bed. Make sure you pack it into that firm seed bed. Now, how are we going to pack it? There's a lot of different options out there. but we really do need to pack. You're going to greatly improve that seed soil contact when you cultipack. You're going to speed up germination, and that's really, really important for us when we're just broadcasting this seed. So if you're going to broadcast, I really feel like you need to cultipack afterwards. Now, there are some issues with that. If you look in the top left picture and the bottom left picture, you would notice two more conventional style cultipackers where the wheels have almost like teeth on the wheels. And if you look in this picture here, you can actually see where each tooth print went. The problem with that is we can only go 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch deep. All right, so it may be an issue that we plant too deep with this type of cultipacker. One of the ways to prevent that is to run the cultipacker before you plant and then follow up after you plant with the same machine, or switch to a lawn roller, which is smooth, it doesn't have teeth like you see in this image. All right, here you're going to get a more level, you don't have those little depressions in there. And then again, you know, a lot of folks are going to stick to letting the rain handle it for them, and that is okay, but you're more likely to spread out the germination, and you're also more likely to spread out the seed in an uneven manner. Planting live plants or plugs, we got several options for that. Some folks prefer to do it with a dibble bar like we'd use in a forest site. Other folks use a plug tool. It's basically this tool right here, and the one that this gentleman's using. It has a cone on it that has a sharpened edge, and you use your foot and your body weight to stomp it into the ground, and it removes a plug of soil that is almost the exact same size as the plug you're going to plant. So you would pull that plug of soil out, stick in the plug that you're planting, step on each side of it, press it into the soil, and walk on to the next one. Somebody that has done it a lot can move through a site and plant a pretty significant acreage in a day's time. And if you got the right crew doing it, you can plant a very significant acreage in a short amount of time. But for most folks planting at a large scale like you'd see on a decent sized solar operation, they're either going to use a vegetable transplanter or a tree transplanter, like this gentleman's riding here. So on that well-prepared seed bed, he's riding along, and he sticks that plug in there, and it is preset so that it drops one at a specified distance every time, which really helps you keep everything evenly distributed as you move across that site. When are we going to plant these live plugs? Late fall and winter, when they're dormant, is a really good option in my opinion. You know, take those dormant plugs and go ahead and get them in the ground. If you do want to plant in the spring, I would suggest going with early spring, you know, beginning of March, mid-March, depending on where you're at in the state. But go ahead and get those out before we're really hot. Also, another thing to keep in mind with those plugs, you don't want them sitting around a long time before you go plant them. You know, go pick those plugs up when you're ready to plant. They don't need to sit in the back of the truck, or they don't need to sit in the warehouse for weeks waiting on you to plant them. If they do have to wait a couple of days, I would suggest putting them in refrigeration. A lot of the vendors that are out there now are selling live plants. The volume is not the same as what you would see for seed, but there are species that are available, and you can get live plants now for these projects. You could also collect the seed and start your own plugs like you see in these images. It doesn't have to be in a greenhouse, but you could do it in a greenhouse. You could do it in an outdoor nursery. The trays are readily available. The potting media is readily available. You can order all those things and start your own if you'd like to do it that way. All right, one of the big issues with solar is you have to be a patient human being if you want to get into creating solar pollinator habitat. Even the most successful pollinator plantings that I've been a part of looked like failures for the first year. Some of them looked like failures for 18 months. Some of them looked like failures for 2 years. But eventually, we got to where we wanted. You just have to be patient, and you have to be prepared and go into this with the understanding that we're not establishing turf and we're not establishing an agronomic crop. It's going to take 3 years before you see what you want to see out of these native warm season plants. So what should we expect in year one? So we're going to plant this year. What are we going to see? You're going to see these plants begin to establish themselves. They're not showy. They're not filling in the site. You got a lot of bare soil still visible, and it is most definitely not a beautiful meadow in most situations at the end of year one. Now there are things we can do in year one, like adding some annuals into that mix to give you a lot more color and vegetation. So that can be a way to reduce that. But in general, at the end of year one, it is not going to be that beautiful thing you were looking for. Now year two, vegetation growth is going to be a lot more visible. We're going to have some of these plants really starting to flower. You're going to see fewer and fewer of these bare spots, and the bare spots you do see won't be as large. And you're definitely going to be seeing a lot of growth out of these plants in year two. Year three, the plants that we planted by year three should dominate that site. It's now their home. Other people may visit, other flowers, other things may visit, but it is the plants that we have put into the ground ourselves that dominate that site. We're going to have flowers available throughout the year, and we're going to have a beautiful scene of these native warm season plants. And at this point, we're pretty much done. All she needs is a little care every year and she'll continue on. So what does that look like? So this would be year one planting. Shortly after planting, you're going to see these perennial plants germinate. You're going to see them start to form little clumps or rosettes, or depending on the species, but you will be able to see, very much be able to see individual plants coming up. All right, and if you look in that middle picture, this was a solar project we did. The native warm season grasses fared better in the first year than a lot of the broadleaf plants that we put in. But you can still see, look at all that bare soil out there. That's not a horrible site. I can take you back to it at year two, and it's actually done very well in year two. But be prepared, there's going to be bare soil throughout year one. Exact same thing in that picture on the right. Lots of bare soil visible at the end of year one. You do have some species flowering, and you can go pick out some of the plant species that you planted, but you're going to have bare soil, and you're going to need another year to be really, starting to see what you did. In year two, if you'll notice there, these pictures are under a utility right-of-way where we've done some of this work. In year two, you should start seeing nice clumps of the warm season grasses that we planted. You're going to see a lot more flower availability throughout the year in year two. Some of these species are going to be blooming early spring all the way through the year. That's the idea, is we want flowers throughout the year. But one of the big things to notice in year two, the vegetation has really started to grow, and you're still seeing bare soils, but it's in much smaller parcels. And when we make it to year three, it's let the good times roll. Everything's filled in. We have everybody satisfied on the soils. We have no runoff issues at this point. We have a good vegetative layer across that site. Lots of different species of flowers blooming when you go out there. Lots of pollinator usage. Songbirds are utilizing the area. So at the end of year three, you finally get to reap the reward of all that work you've put into this. Patience is a virtue, and solar habitat will teach you that. So once we have these established, what do we have to do to manage them? There's not a lot that goes into managing them once we get them established. Those first 3 years are the critical years. And once we get to that point, then after that, it's pretty simple. We're going to use herbicide applications to knock out the unwanted vegetation. And depending on what we have, we can be very selective. We can select herbicides that would only kill grasses that have showed up that we don't want to use. We can pick herbicides that would take out broadleaf plants and not impact the grasses. Lots of different opportunities there to be very selective with our herbicides to target the species we want to control and not impact the others as significantly. Woody stems are bound to show up in all of these sites over time. That's just the natural progression of a plant community. Woody stems try to come in. What we've been doing in some of the sites I've worked with is coming in and cutting those woody stems down and then spraying the stumps with an herbicide. Just the little small piece of stump that remains, putting a pure herbicide on that and allowing it to kill that root system. It is very, very selective application. You're not going to cause damage to the species growing around it. Vegetation height is one that brings up concern in a solar installation. We're going to do this through the use of plant growth regulators or mowing. Plant growth regulators to me are a much better option than mowing. Part of growing these plant species is not just the flowers that they provide, but also the fact that these pollinators utilize these as locations to complete life cycles and locations to use to hide and rest and all of these things. So if we mow all that vegetation off, we've lost a big component of what we were trying to do. So we're going to minimize how often we mow. By using plant growth regulators, we can accomplish the same thing without losing some of those habitat components that we need. So competition control, how do we deal with some of these things? We're going to have problem species, no question, in every site. There's going to be species that show up. Even if we do the best possible job we can with site prep, we're still going to develop these species. We got to figure out what species are present. Another opportunity for working with your local extension agent. Get a good specific ID on what those problem species are. And then you can use spot spray treatments, cut stem treatments, just depends on which species you're dealing with, so that you're making minimal herbicide applications within that landscape, and you're not likely to damage as many plants as if we went through and treated the whole site. All right. And full site herbicide applications might be required and might be possible, depending on what species we've planted and what species is showing up. Some of the species that we plant are fairly tolerant to a couple different herbicides, which would allow us, if we time everything right, to come in with an herbicide when we wouldn't hurt the plants that we put in the ground intentionally, but would take out the plants that had shown up that we don't want. So it is possible to do that. Plant growth regulators, I mentioned those briefly. Plant growth regulators have been around for a very long time, and they're used in a lot of different components of agriculture. They're used in a lot of different components of turf management. But with regards to solar installations, we're going to be using them mostly to stop cell division and elongation. So essentially what we're doing is using a hormone to convince that plant that it has reached the maximum height that it needs to reach before it starts flowering. We're encouraging that plant to stop putting on vertical growth with the use of a hormone. Typically it doesn't interfere with flowering, but what you will see is the node distance, the distance between nodes gets greatly shorter. So you would see plants that wouldn't normally look like the phlox that's in this picture may look very similar to the phlox that's in this picture, because instead of the nodes being 8 inches apart, they're less than 1 inch apart, depending on when we applied that plant growth regulator. So you might see those flowers start stacking up on top of each other a little closer than you normally would. But you still have the flowers present, you still have the stems present, and you still have the things present that you need for those pollinators to utilize. Mowing is going to be a component in these solar installations. I haven't visited with anyone yet who didn't intend to at least occasionally mow in these sites. My biggest suggestion is do everything you can to minimize how often you're mowing. You know, during the establishment process, that first year or 2 years, we may mow pretty frequently, maybe 4 or 5 times during the growing season. We're doing this to target some of these annual plants that came up on their own. What we're trying to do with the mower at that point in the process is reduce the possibility of seed being put onto that site. So we're going to continue to mow that plant species and keep it from putting seed on. That's the concept there. All right. But after we make it through that stage and our established planting are there and they're still dominating that site, we're not mowing multiple times every year. In fact, we don't even need to mow every year. In many cases, we don't need to mow every other year. A lot of times, I think we'd be better off on a 3 to 4 year rotation, just depending on where we're at. Now, having said that, you can always come in and treat the woody stems that show up. I know that's a big issue for a lot of sites, is we're going to have woody stems coming in, and we want to use a mower to knock those woody stems back. We don't have to use a mower to do that. We don't have to disturb the whole site. We can come through there with an herbicide and just take out the woody stems and not damage everything else. All right. But after we are established and we do need to mow, we're ideally going to do that in very late winter or very early spring, just prior to that fresh green up. That way we're not going through a period of time where there's going to be a long period with none of that plant available. We've allowed it to make it all the way through the growing season. We've allowed it to make it all the way through the dormant season. And before the new growth comes on, we can knock it back and let the new growth take off from there. All right, that's the ideal way to do this. All right, the other thing that we would do ideally is set these things up on a rotation so that the entire facility is not being mowed in any given year. I think most of the things you're going to look at are going to tell you to do a quarter to a half of the site on any given year, but no more than that. I think for us at Clemson, a third is kind of where we're at. No more than a third of that site should be mowed on any given year. And what we need to do is set it up like you see in these examples. So in this example, this block would be mowed on year 1, this block would be mowed on year 2, this block on year 3. And then you would start back over. This block on year 1, this block on year 2, this block on year 3. Now what this does is it allows you over a 3-year period to mow that entire site, all right? But it doesn't do a good job of connecting all of this habitat that we've created. In fact, we isolate it. So on year 1, there would be stubble here, but you would have very short stubble here. You would have the remaining biomass of plants in blocks 2 and 3, all right? These are connected, but this one and this one are not connected. So in order for a pollinator or a bird or any other species of wildlife to go from existing vegetation to the next patch of existing vegetation, they're going to have to cross a gap. That can be problematic when trying to manage wildlife. So a better way of doing this is to break it up even further and rotate these things around to increase connectivity. So in this situation, what we did was the same pattern we had up top, but we cut it in half. So you'd also have the same number of blocks on the bottom. And then you just rotate the years that you're going to put the disturbance in so that you always have connectivity. So on year 1, these 2 spots would both be mowed, but the animals could go and the insects could go from this block to this block to this block to this block without ever having to go through an open site. You have connected all of that habitat and made it much more friendly for wildlife. There's some issues that I've also seen on these sites with how are we going to mow up under these panels, and that does become an issue. When it gets under that array, it's not easy to get a batwing mower to swing under there. You know, there's so many braces in that thing that's very difficult. It can be done with a sidearm mower if you have access to sidearm mowers, and then it can be done with a 0-turn mower, and I've also seen some folks at this point doing it with weed trimmers. And the right crew of people that know how to use weed trimmers can go through there and clean these sites out pretty fast up under the panels. The big thing though, you don't want to take this stuff all the way down to the ground, and you're not mowing it like you would your lawn. Ideally, we're leaving a foot of vegetation after we mow. Now that's going to require some specializations to your equipment. If you're using rotary mowers, you're going to have to develop some jack systems to bring that mower up a foot off the ground for those mowings. Never under any circumstances get less than 6 inches. You don't want to do that, and you don't want to scalp the soils with those mowers because you're disturbing the soil and you're making areas for unwanted vegetation to come in. The other thing is we have gopher tortoises in a lot of the counties where solar farms are going in South Carolina. If you're in one of the counties that has gopher tortoises, these sites are going to be ideal locations for gopher tortoises. The law states that you can't mow below 12 inches in the presence of gopher tortoises. So as a general rule for statewide, whether you know or don't know, I would just go ahead and stick with that 12-inch mowing within these solar installations. So just to summarize what we've been through, you need to develop a plan for these solar activities very early in the process. You know, we're going to start planning out these solar plantings before we start planning out the solar installation itself, or at the same time. You don't need to wait till everything's already created, it's bolted up and ready to go, all right? This needs to start early in the process. We have to do a good job of creating a clean, weed-free, well-prepared seed bed. If you don't take the time to create a weed-free seed bed, you probably shouldn't waste the money on trying to establish native plants, because that's what you're doing, is wasting money. Take the time. It's got to be thought out. Don't do this as a last-minute part of the process. This needs to be an initial thought part of that process. Don't plant too deep. When you do make it to that point to plant, there's nothing wrong with running behind that planter and flicking some dirt with your finger to see how deep it's actually planting that seed, and to make sure that it's dropping that seed every so many inches like you want it to, all right? Get behind that planter and double check it. The big one, be patient. You're not going to get where you want to be at the end of year 1. You're not going to be where you want to be at the end of year 2. It's going to be in year 3 where you really start to see these plantings shine and they really start to represent what you wanted to see. Use herbicides as you need to control this unwanted vegetation. Work closely with your Clemson Extension folks on that. make sure you're using the right products for the right plants. It will greatly impact the successfulness of that application. If you're really concerned about plant height, let's say we have a great growing season this year and all the plants want to get taller than they're supposed to. There's nothing wrong with it enlisting the assistance of one of those plant growth regulators. Get out there and make that application. You may have to make more than one application in a growing season depending on the conditions. Get out there and use that. It's far better in my opinion than trying to mow. And then maintenance mowing on rotation. We don't want to mow that whole site on any given year, and we don't want to mow that site below 12 inches, right? If you need to discuss any of this with me, feel free to reach out to me. Email's the best way to get a hold of me. It's in this slide behind me here. Feel free, shoot me an email and I'll try to work with you on anything you have. Thank you for your time and I look forward to seeing your solar pollinator habitat.